Greetings, students. I hope you're doing well. This is week 5 already. I'm counting. But I have to count. I have to figure out which week we're in so I know which philosopher to talk about, right? So for the next 2 weeks, we're supposed to talk about John Locke. And I should say he is known for the work, 2 treatises on government. That's a very important work in political philosophy, but it doesn't really fit with the broader themes of this course, so we're not really covering it, right? Locke did have a strong influence on the people who wrote the United States Constitution and basically founded our government. That's just not what we're interested in here, right? So rather than the 2 treatises, we are focused on an essay concerning human understanding, which is a work that Locke published in 1689. And just to situate that a little bit, that's 39 years after Descartes died in Sweden. Poor guy, right? He died in 1650. And Locke seems to have worked on this book for probably 20 years before he actually published it, right? So it is the result of a lot of thinking about Descartes, about the new science, which is something Descartes was thinking about, right? Locke himself mentions in the Epistle to the Reader, epistle is letter, you probably know that, you're upper division students, but I thought I'd throw it out there. Yeah, so he mentions in this epistle that, he's basically in a salon. He was meeting with other people to talk about ideas, to talk about new scientific ideas, and people liked what Locke had to say, and they told him, hey, write this down so we can talk about it in even more detail and we can understand your ideas better. A lot of good books begin this way. Sometimes people with good ideas are just asked to write them down. And the person obliges, and then we end up with an important book, right? And that's what happened here. All right, so getting into the book then. And it does start with that epistle. In that part of the book, Locke explains the original idea behind it, and I'm going to quote him here from page 292. He says that the idea is to examine our own abilities and see what objects our understandings were or were not fitted to deal with. I'm just going to mute something here so it won't interrupt the video again. Okay, so in other words, he's going to think about what can actually be in the understanding, what wouldn't show up in the understanding, right? If that's something we can even think about. It seems to be, right? So what are the objects of thought, and what can we actually deal with in thought? If we know that, we can do a better job of seeking knowledge, right? We can't have knowledge of what we can't think clearly about or what can never really enter our minds. So let's sort of clean up our notion of the understanding, and then we'll do a better job of gaining knowledge and determining what is spurious knowledge, what's really fake knowledge. some of the things Descartes says might turn out to be spurious, right? Because he wouldn't have any way to know what he claims to know, right? He thinks there are pure ideas, pure innate ideas, and Locke is rejecting that, and so he's going to reject some of Descartes' knowledge claims as a result. Okay, so moving on from there, as I said, Locke is interested in the new science, in the new quantitative science, although he doesn't really call it the new quantitative science. But he's in conversation with scientists. He mentions Newton by name, right? And he knows Newton personally. So he wants to work with the sciences somehow, right? I said this with respect to Descartes already. The sciences aren't really separate from philosophy yet at this point, right? They bleed into each other. Locke uses that phrase natural philosophy instead of saying science, right? So there's philosophy, and then there's natural philosophy, and natural philosophy means physical sciences, and so from this point of view, what we call the sciences are just a narrow part of philosophy. So we don't think about it that way anymore. But even in Locke's lifetime, now he died in 1704, right? But even in Locke's lifetime, in the late 1600s, the sciences were called natural philosophy, and they were a branch of philosophy. So anyway, Locke is doing science a service, or natural philosophy a service, by cleaning up some really basic ideas and figuring out what the understanding can and cannot do. So he's got this nice image. It's a well-known image of himself as an under-laborer, as he calls it in the sciences. He says that's ambition enough, to be an under-laborer in the sciences, clearing the ground of rubbish so that the sciences can flourish. Okay, and another nice image is in the introduction on page 293. He compares the understanding to the eye, right? So the eye tends to focus on other objects, observe other objects without really being able to get a look at itself. Only under special circumstances could the eye get a look at itself. You need a mirror, you need a special instrument. So it's similar with the understanding. It's constantly dealing with other objects. So something special has to happen for it to take a look at itself. There has to be a special effort involved, right? And again, that's what Locke is up to. Still looking at the intro, there's this interesting statement, it seems, of metaphysical neutrality. Locke says he won't bother with he won't bother with physical considerations surrounding the mind. In other words, he doesn't seem to be interested in the metaphysics of the mind the way Descartes was, right? So Descartes was doing epistemology and metaphysics at the same time, and maybe even in a sloppy way, and maybe Descartes tried to derive some metaphysical conclusions from what were merely epistemological considerations. Maybe Descartes did something like that. Locke, for his part, says, I'm staying away from the metaphysics of the mind. That's not how he puts it. That's not his wording, but that's what he's saying. I'm not going to worry about the physical basis of the mind, or whether there is a physical basis. I'm not going to get into that. That's not what this book is about. And he goes on to say, still looking at the intro, that his method is historical. And what he seems to mean by that is, well, he's interested in the origin of ideas. Where do they come from? And he thinks he can tell a compelling story about that. Still looking at the intro, but near the end. This is page 295. Locke claims he is proceeding in a practical way. He's looking for the measures or standards, we could say, by which humans ought to govern their opinions and actions, right? So, epistemology and ethics, then, right? How do we know when we know, right? And we won't get to the ethics so much, but that does come up in book 4, right? We're really going to focus on book 2 more than anything else. But anyway, that's what he's looking for: standards for knowing and standards for acting, epistemology and ethics. And just before we get into or just before we get out of the intro, let's put it that way, Locke tells us what he means by idea, and I think that's worth noting. I think it's interesting in its own right. So page 295, section 8, he says, what is an idea? And he goes on to explain, it's whatever is the object of understanding when a man thinks. Putting the sexist language aside, what's interesting there is there's a notion of intentionality, which is going to become a very important topic in phenomenology in the 20th century and going into the 21st century. So Locke is thinking in terms of objects of thought. What are the objects of thought? And he's using the word idea in a very generic way to refer to whatever the object is. If it's something we can think about, then it's an idea. Does it also exist in the world? Well, it might. Right? But hard to know, as we saw with Descartes. Locke is carrying some Cartesian baggage in some interesting ways. Okay. So as we move forward here, Locke starts talking about innate ideas and how he thinks he can disprove them. And mainly he thinks he can disprove the existence of innate ideas and innate principles by showing how we could have the knowledge we actually do, the knowledge we actually seem to have, without there being any innate ideas. Right? So Occam's razor seems to be at work here. Right? You've probably heard of Occam's razor. I don't know how much thought you've given it, but sometimes Occam's razor is put this way: let's not multiply the existence of entities beyond what's absolutely necessary. Right? Let's not posit the existence of things that we don't need to explain whatever we're trying to explain. I hope that makes some sense. I mean, a historical example would be we, people in the Western world at least, used to believe in celestial spheres, right? So it used to be thought that the Earth was at the center of the universe, and the moon was going around the Earth. We still believe that, but the sun was going around the Earth, and the stars were going around the Earth. And I mentioned three different things there because each was thought to be held in place by a different celestial sphere. So the moon was fixed in place by a celestial sphere, the sun by a different sphere, the stars by yet another sphere, right? Everything tended to go earthward, right? That's how it seems from our perspective on the Earth. So you need these spheres to hold these bodies in place above the Earth, right? And then as we developed various theories, but especially a theory of gravity, we realized, we don't need to say that there are these celestial spheres. We can account for things being in motion seemingly around the Earth without positing these celestial spheres, which we didn't have, direct knowledge of anyway. They were posits. They were theoretical posits. We thought they were needed to keep these celestial bodies in place. Then we realized they weren't. Then we got rid of them, and we said, oh, never mind. There are no celestial spheres. Right, that's a use of Occam's razor. We kind of thought we needed to posit, to suppose the existence of celestial spheres to explain what we wanted to explain, which is why those bodies are staying up there away from the Earth. Then we found another way to account for it, and then we got rid of the celestial spheres. And Locke is saying, I can account for the knowledge we have or seem to have without appealing to any innate ideas or principles. Therefore, using Occam's razor, we're going to get rid of innate ideas and principles, right? Locke doesn't mention Occam as far as I've seen, but that's the idea anyway. Okay, so now we get into arguments. How do people argue for innate ideas? Well, Locke mentions the argument of universal assent, page 296. We're in chapter 2 now, right? Chapter 1 was the introduction. So when I was talking about the intro, I was talking about chapter 1. Chapter 2 deals with innate ideas, innate principles. How have people argued for them? How is Locke going to undermine those arguments, which, by the way, is what he thinks he needs to do. He doesn't exactly need a positive argument here. He needs an explanation of where knowledge comes from, which he'll give in book 2. In book 1, he's giving negative arguments because, as I've said, he thinks if he can just show how knowledge is possible without appealing to innate ideas or principles, that will be enough. So to pave the way, he will undermine positive arguments people have given in favor of innate ideas and principles, right? So there's this argument from universal assent. Aren't there principles that everybody assents to, everybody agrees to, in other words? And doesn't that show that it's built into our soul? The reason we're all agreeing is that it's imprinted on the mind or it's imprinted on the soul from birth, and therefore we all agree, we all think it's true. Right? And then Locke counters, there is no universal assent, therefore there are no innate principles. What would an example be of an innate principle, or something that people were taking to be an innate principle? An example that Locke mentions is the same thing cannot be and not be at the same time. Right? Something cannot be and not be at the same time. It is or it isn't, to simplify. Right? So wouldn't everybody assent to that? And wouldn't that show that it's built into the furniture of the mind or something like that? And again, Locke is saying, well, no, not everybody agrees to that. We don't have universal assent, and therefore there is no innate knowledge. Children and idiots, that's not my term, that's Locke's term. How would we put that now? People who are intellectually impaired, we could say. They don't have the intellectual capacity that we think a normal human being should have, that we expect a human being to have, right? So children and people who are intellectually impaired, they're not going to agree to this idea that the same thing cannot be and not be at the same time. They're not going to agree that that's impossible, right? For whatever reason, we don't need to get into that, but you're not going to get assent, right? And that's Locke's point, and he goes on to say, look, if there's a principle in the mind, then the mind should be able to perceive it. Otherwise, what are we talking about, basically, right? So if this principle that the same thing cannot be and not be at the same time, if it's in the mind should be able to perceive it. So the child and the intellectually impaired person should be able to perceive it, right? But they don't know what you're talking about, maybe, when you state that principle. You're not going to get assent from all the children and all the intellectually impaired, even if you get it from some of them, right? So then the principle isn't there, right? If it were there, they would perceive it, and then they would agree with it as a result of what they perceive. And Locke also argues that innate principles, they can't be implicit. Not that he uses that word, I don't think, but that is what he's suggesting. They can't just be implicit. It doesn't work. What are we saying if we're saying they're implicit? Well, we could argue that an innate principle is something we are able to be aware of when it's triggered, right? You could say, well, it's innate, but it's not something you actually perceive in your own mind until it's triggered somehow. It has to be made explicit. But Locke's response to that is, what in the world are you talking about, right? Any bit of knowledge that we don't already know is knowledge we could know. And it gets activated when you have the right perception, or when somebody shares the knowledge with you through language, right? And then it's activated and explicit. We're trying to distinguish what's innate from what's learned, And if we go the route of saying, well, innate knowledge is what's there implicitly and can be activated later, that's not distinguishing what's innate from what's learned, right? What's learned is also knowledge that you're able to have, right? So what's the mark there? It's not clear. It's a good argument. If we say, well, innate knowledge is just implicit. It has to be activated. Well, now we can't tell the difference between innate knowledge that's activated when somebody mentions it to you and non-innate knowledge that's activated because somebody reported it to you and now you know it as a result of what they said. How would you be able to tell the difference? It's a difference without a distinction, as philosophers sometimes like to say. There's also a question about what exactly it means for knowledge to be innate, and so Locke heavily criticizes things other people have said about that. Maybe you could say knowledge is innate if you know it as soon as you attain to the use of reason, or in other words, knowledge is innate when you know it as soon as you start exercising your reason. Let's put it that way, right? But how would that actually work? How would that actually go, right? You listen to a child. Some of you might have children. I do. They gain reason slowly over time. It seems like they're using their reason, they're figuring things out in the world long before they can state really abstract principles, such as, the same thing cannot be and not be at the same time. I mean, that, if you're around children a lot, you know that that's a late development, being able to state a really abstract principle like that. So what is the innate theorist's explanation of that exactly? Locke says he doesn't know how they can explain it. Now, of course, Locke's explanation is, they know the principle later, right? First they observe, first they experience the world, then they make this abstract statement, and it's an abstract statement because it's based on abstraction. It's abstracted from individual experiences that they've had. In other words, obviously Locke's an empiricist, right? So that really abstract principle that people are saying is innate, Locke is going to say, nope, it's not there except through experience, and yes, it's abstract and formal, and that's because it's abstracted from lots of individual experiences, right? So something that might seem innate is actually the result of long experience, and then that jibes well with what we actually see in children's development. So Locke is on pretty good grounds here, it seems to me, right? And then he also says, and this is a good point as well, look, if you have an innate principle in your mind and reason hasn't discovered it yet, do you know it or do you not know it? I mean, it's innate knowledge, right? So you're supposed to know it, but it's waiting for reason to come along and recognize that it's there, and then you know it. I mean, maybe if you had a more elaborate theory of knowledge, this could work. On the face of it, what you're saying is that if it's innate and reason hasn't recognized it yet, hasn't seen it in the soul yet, then it's known and unknown, which of course doesn't work. We don't want to derive contradictions from our view, right? And so if our view is there is innate knowledge, it's there in the soul, waiting for reason to recognize it, and then it becomes knowledge, then Locke's response is, well, then we know and don't know these innate principles, right? When we're born, say, right? Reason hasn't recognized anything when we're born, but those things are supposed to be there in our soul, so we know and don't know them, right? So that seems like rubbish. Okay. He also points out some problems with using assent, or again agreement, as a criterion for what's innate. If you assent to it as soon as you hear it or become familiar with it, then it's innate, someone might say. Well, lots of problems with that. One of them that Locke mentions is, look, think about what children can assent to and the order in which they can assent to it, right? So, in a sense, through their actions, very, very young children, toddlers, show us that they can tell the difference between sweet and bitter. They know how to pursue sweet things and avoid bitter things. That seems right. Right, and then it's much later, so I'm just going with Locke's example here, maybe it's not that relatable, but it's much later that they can say something like, well, sugar plums and wormwood are two very different things, right? So first children are pursuing the sweet and avoiding the bitter and showing us that they can distinguish the two. Later they can say, oh, a sugar plum is sweet and wormwood is bitter, and so these are two different things. And then later they can say two objects with opposite properties can't be the same object, right? The innate theorist is getting things backwards, right? They think we know these innate principles first, and Locke is saying that's not how it works with kids, right? I mean, you are talking about real human beings here who develop over time. It's not how it works, right? So good point, Locke. Okay. Also, if we think it's true that assenting to something as soon as you hear it is a mark of innateness, then that makes the category of innate principles much bigger than the innate theorists actually want to make it. So Locke mentions something like, well, white is not black, right? Also red is not green. Also green is not blue, right? Have you actually explicitly had those thoughts before? As soon as I say them, you agree with them, but have you had them before? Maybe you haven't, but you agreed to them immediately. Is that really the stuff we want to call innate? Green is not red. It's too much, right? And then you look in the field of mathematics, you get things like 2 plus 3 equals 5, 2 plus 4 equals 6, 1 minus 1 equals 0. How many mathematical statements are simple enough for us to agree with them as soon as we hear them? 2 plus negative 1 is 1. How many statements are there like that in math? Too many. I mean, the innate theorist isn't going to want to say there are that many innate principles. That's not what they were going for, right? So this cuts against the innate theorist. Also, Locke says, look, if an innate principle is really innate, then the ideas that make it up must be innate, right? I mean, it follows, but white is not black. If that's innate because there was immediate assent to it, then the idea of white is innate and the idea of black is innate, but that is also not something that innate theorists wanted to say. Black and white are learned, right? Those are experiences we have. It doesn't really make sense to say they're innate. And then Locke considers, this is around page 299. I haven't been telling you page numbers lately, but if you wanted to look, Locke considers this principle or this claim, black is not white, is that an immediate implication of a more general principle that's innate, right? So maybe it's not that black is not white is innate. Maybe it's that there's some really broad innate principle in us from which we can really quickly conclude, oh, black is not white. But what would the general principle be? You might say, well, if two ideas never appear in the same bit of space together, then they're not the same idea. Well, why is it so much easier to state the implication, which is not innate, than it is to state the broad principle, which is supposed to be innate? So it's supposed to be inborn in you, but you have a hard time formulating it, whereas you have a really easy time saying, oh, black is not white. And then that's not innate. It seems like what's inborn in you, what's innate, that should be easy to see, to perceive in your own mind and to state. But again, that's not really how it is empirically. Okay. So the last thing we'll consider in this lecture, right? In this lecture, we're thinking about book 1. And then in the next lecture, we'll talk about book 2. So the last item for book 1, before we move on from it, is Locke raises this question: are there practical principles that are innate? Practical principles being principles that govern behavior. Primarily ethical principles is what we mean, we philosophers, when we talk about practical principles. So are there ethical principles that are innate? Once we put it that way, it's easy to grasp Locke's main points here. He has 2 main points. This is on pages 301 and 302, by the way. So the main points he makes are, well, number 1, we know there's a lot of disagreement in ethics, right? So that's not a good area to posit innateness. I'm not sure how much I agree with that. I think if you get abstract enough, you might see more agreement than Locke would allow. But anyway, that's the argument. It's easy to point out ethical disagreements, even disagreements about basic ethical principles. It's easy enough to point that out. It's easy enough to point that out. It's not easy to state it. It's easy to point it out. Right. If there's all this disagreement, then it's silly to think that ethical principles are already in our souls when we're born. We should at least state some agreement, right? I mean, we had that argument from assent, right? If you have a principle inborn in you, you should assent to it. But people are disagreeing about basic ethical principles, so it doesn't seem to work. Number two, you would think an innate practical principle would have some bearing on how you behave. So it's not just a matter of assenting to it, but we should expect people to uphold the same standards if practical principles are innate. Because after all, if it's innate, your soul should perceive it, and it should be easy to pay attention to it. And surely we'd behave better if ethical principles just sort of imposed themselves on our minds, and whenever it was relevant, it just sort of popped up, right? Keep your word, for instance. Locke mentions contracts, right? If it were vividly impressed on our souls so that we couldn't help but be aware of it when it was relevant, maybe we'd expect more people to keep their word, right? That makes sense. All right, so it's not very plausible that practical principles are innate. A little more narrowly, it's not very plausible that ethical principles are innate. As far as that goes, that's a good argument, and then we have to stop for now. Thanks for listening.